participating in Holidays in the Heart of the City, like always. I hope everybody goes out for that this weekend. We'll be out at Borchard Park with the Cookie Hut, and we'll be in the parade, and Tom Trombley is going to be the Grand Marshal of the parade. So, yeah, he doesn't like to talk about that, so be sure to harass him. He keeps downplaying it, so we keep annoying him. So anyway, a lot of fun things to be part of in the community this weekend, and we will be there. I hope you will too. All right, any questions about that type of stuff? Awesome. Okay, so the brainchild for this is we have items in our collection that maybe we don't have a reason to have out for a particular exhibit. Sometimes there are things that are simply too fragile to have out all the time. Sometimes there are things that, you know, we put out for a temporary exhibit, but we just don't have space to have everything all the time. We have hundreds of thousands of artifacts in our collection. So we can't show everything all the time. And I like the idea of being able to bring out some things. And we had a lot of fun when our friend David Hall came and did radios. And so that was the first thing I thought of, was like doing something with like tech history type stuff. And I was like, we have some phones and things. Let's talk about phones. So that's where this came from. And if you all like it, we're going to get other staff to bring out some things. And we'll just have like special lunch and learn segments that I like to call Snacks and Artifacts, because who doesn't love a good title? But today, we're going with I Just Called. I won't sing for you, don't worry. So yeah, let's get into it. We're going to talk a little bit about the phones themselves and the technology, and we're going to talk a little bit about the big history around phones, but we're going to talk about Saginaw too, because Saginaw was in the mix from jump, so it's pretty interesting. So, see if my thing works. Ta-da! Okay. Our good friend Alexander Graham Bell. All right, so there's a lot of actually controversy around who really developed the telephone and who did it first. We're not going to get into all that today, because economically what's going to matter in the United States is that Alexander Graham Bell is the one who secures the first patent. So it's interesting, and there's some really good historical books and articles if you're interested in early, that kind of early race. It wasn't really a new idea. Like, people were working on it because the telegraph, of course, was in use by 1836. You have Samuel Morse, who's now developed the Morse code, so the dashes and dots to send those messages. Now, telegraph, Greek roots, tele, distance, graph, text. Distance, text. Well, very quickly, they were thinking about how do we do this with sound? Telephone, distance, sound, or speech, okay? So lots of people are actually working on this. Alexander Graham Bell is sort of interesting in kind of how he gets interested in it. And that's, so he's from Scotland. We were just talking about Scotland. So he is actually Scottish born. His family will eventually leave Scotland, and they settle in Boston. His father, his uncle, and his grandfather were all authorities on elocution and speech therapy for the deaf. So he's very early on expected to walk in the family's footsteps, and he's always thinking scientifically about sound, okay? So he does get into the family business. One of his young pupils was Helen Keller. Now, this is a cool picture. This is actually in our collection, because this is Helen Keller in Saginaw in 1914, visiting the Saginaw Institute for the Blind. So we don't know why there's a deer, but it's a cool picture. Actually, this is a recent find. It was sort of in a collection that wasn't like specified that it was there, and it's like one of those treasure hunts that actually happens. It's really cool. So Bell was primarily that's his source of income. That's what he's doing. He's working with the deaf, and his scientific pursuits, that's a hobby. Okay, it's really fascinating. He gets up to all sorts of things, not just the phone. His first major thing was commercial improvements for Edison's phonograph. He made his own flying machine. After President Garfield was shot, he actually rushed to invent a metal detector. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to save the president's life, but his thought was if he could, like how metal detectors work, if he could find that bullet. So that doesn't work out, but it just gives you this sense that this is a man who's thinking about how the world works in a lot of different ways. So by the time Bell starts experimenting with sending sound over the wire, telegraph had already been in successful operation for 30 years. Okay, so just kind of give you a thought process of how these things happen. So he's convinced that multiple sound waves could be sent and interpreted on the same wire. And he talked about it as a sort of multiple telegraph. Obviously, I said at the start, he's not the first to have this idea. He's just the first to execute it successfully enough to get the patent secured. June 2nd, 1875, Bell sends the first call to his assistant in another room. And he says, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." And Watson was able to hear that and understand that over the telephone and showed up in the room. So this first phone call. It's not as exciting. The first telegraph message sent with Morse code was, "What hath God wrought?" So Morse really thought about posterity and what that would be. Alexander Graham Bell just asked for his assistant to come next door. So, So now how this happens where Bell becomes the thing is partly due to who he's married to. So his father-in-law, Gardner Green Hubbard, he's the first who really sees the business opportunity. He's a Boston lawyer who had a deep and loathing hatred of Western Union and their monopoly over the telegraph lines. So he had money and used his wealth to back Bell in hopes of breaking the Western Union's monopoly. And so 1876, Bell patents his device. By 1877, construction on the first regular telephone line from Boston to Somerville, Massachusetts began. Now, those are not all that far apart if anybody's familiar with Boston geography. It's basically just across the river. But still, it's a distance, right? So that's 1877. By 1880, there were over 49,000 telephones in the United States. Things moved fast. That's what really surprised me when I was looking at this, is just how fast it moved. So Alexander founded the Bell Telephone Company in 1877. And because he had his patent, it was hard to compete with him, and he would snap up any competitors. We're not going to get into all the details because actually it could be its own several hours of Lunch and Learns to try to understand all of what happens there. But the Bell Company becomes known as the American Bell Company by 1880. And one of its subsidiaries was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which was incorporated in 1885. So this is a subsidiary of Bell's company. Now, when Bell's original patent expires, so he's got a stranglehold, and it's actually really expensive to have phones or to use the lines. once Bell's patent expires in 1893, it's going to be like the Wild West of new technology, and all these independents are getting in the game, and all this money is moving around, and mergers, and companies failing, and companies buying out other companies. Again, too much to really talk about right now. But what ends up happening that really impacts us today is first, the cost dropped, and more people had phones. And so then it becomes a thing that's not a novelty. It's not just useful for some, it's becoming a thing that we're gonna embrace. And then the other thing that happens is December 1899, American Telephone and Telegraph Company acquires the assets of the American Bell Company. So the subsidiary bought it out and became the parent. They kind of flipped. So that's AT&T, right? Did you catch on? Okay. So it's fascinating to me that a company that we still have is like truly rooted in like the origins of all of this with Alexander Graham Bell. So now AT&T, it then has its own subsidiaries, and we'll talk about that because of course Michigan will have Michigan Bell, which is then a subsidiary. But it's all connected. Now, this monopoly is actually authorized by the government in 1913 in something called the Kingsbury Commitment. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on when we talk about Saginaw, but people wanted the monopoly, which sounds a little strange, but they felt like everything was kind of confusing. So if it was there and could be regulated, maybe the monopoly was a better thing. So nobody really fought it, but they did, as early as this time, start calling it Ma Bell. So I know some people have heard that nickname. So it's actually as old as 1915. Now, 1915, Alexander Graham Bell will make the first transcontinental call from Boston to San Francisco, where once again Thomas Watson answers that call. So they set that up. I don't even know what they said. Hopefully it was something more fascinating. I didn't think to look and see if, surely there's a record of what was said. Okay, so what is going on in Saginaw? Okay, I couldn't remember what my next slide was, sorry. Okay, so it's really fascinating. There's not a lot published about it that I could find in like papers and such right away, but by the 1830s, they have a lot to say about phones, and we'll talk about why that is. So there are some really interesting news articles out there. Now, the first city directory that had phone numbers was 1879. So that's really fast again. Like, Saginaw's not a backwater. Saginaw's in the mix. Like, Saginaw, it needs to be connected. So the first, it's hard to find the details about the attitudes and things, but the details we do know are the first telephone line in Saginaw connected the offices of Sanford Keeler, the superintendent of the Flint and Pear Marquette Railroad, with H.C. Potter, who was general manager of the railroad. That makes a lot of sense, right? So these men had phones not only in their offices, but also in their residences. That I thought was interesting. But again, I don't have any info on their thoughts about this or how people were thinking about it. What you do see if you flip through city directories is Saginaw matches a national pattern that many of the first businesses, usually it was businesses first who had phones, not residences, and most of the first businesses to have phones were pharmacies. And they would connect to the lab, the compounding lab, okay, so that they could fulfill orders and anticipate needs much more rapidly. And a lot of those pharmacies and other businesses would advertise that you could use their phone. So if you needed to make a phone call in these early years, you might just pop down to your local pharmacy and use their phone. Saginaw's evening news in their little front corner of every front page would announce that they had a phone line that you could use. So you could go down to the newspaper and use the phone. So this is just kind of how things were at the time. The first central office was opened on July 17th, 1879. Remember when the first phones appear in the directory? 1879. So it's all coming together. Sorry, I'll try not to. So that's a postcard image of it. These were important enough buildings that they would be found on postcards. The Bliss Block at the corner of Genesee and Washington, so across from the Bancroft. Yep. So they had 50 subscribers, and then within 6 months of their initial subscriber drive, they were up to over 80 subscribers, and then within 5 years, they had nearly 2,000. So again, this is like exponential growth. This is really happening fast. So the first company was known as the Saginaw Valley Telephone Company, which was a sub-license of the Telephone and Telegraph Construction Company of Detroit, which is the ancestor of Michigan Bell, and that was all under a license contract secured from Gardner Hubbard, father-in-law to Alexander Graham Bell. Okay? I told you, it's really confusing when you try to trace all these things, so we won't do it all, but the important thing to realize is how much the Bell family was controlling it, and that included what we had in Saginaw. So the idea of merging, once we had this Wild West moment of all these independents, Saginaw liked the idea of merging into a monopoly. And the Saginaw Evening News reported in 1903, so they called it a truce between Michigan Bell and the independent companies. And they thought it would provide more convenient and reliable service. They wrote, "The telephone business is the most natural monopoly with which we have to deal, or rather it is one business that ought to be a monopoly, regulated in the interest of the public and not avaricious stockholders." So basically they said the independents served their purpose in, quote, humbling the Bell Company. But they also made an utter mess of things, and we need to get things cleaned up now, and make it easier for the consumer to subscribe to be able to connect. Because if you were not in the same, if you couldn't use the same lines, you couldn't necessarily call people, okay? So this was a bit of a mess. They did expect that the rates would be kept within reasonable bounds, and they said, quote, "The public expects investors to have reasonable profits, but it does not expect extortionate gains under the guise of making a fair profit on an overcapitalized enterprise." So there's this expectation of regulation, but they're sick of it being just full-on complete competition. So it's just it's a different mindset than maybe we're as comfortable with today. A different way of processing things. This is actually a picture of that Bliss Block building from the newspaper, which is why it's so grainy and not quite as good as the postcard painting one, but so you can see the lines on the top, the telephone lines and exchanges. Okay, so we'll talk about some numbers and stuff. So this is from the 1880s. One of the, just so you can see kind of what a listing would look like. So you see a lot of variation in numbers. And then I was trying to find people. So here's the Heaven Riches, here's their store phone line, but then Carl and Max had resident numbers. Here's A.T. Bliss, and there. Wellington R. Burt's phone number was 128. So if you want to call. So one thing I found fascinating. Here are the hills. Guess who's not there? Arthur didn't have a phone. He doesn't have one for a while. It's not until the 20th century that I can find a phone number for him, and at first it's just the business. And then, so I just imagine him as like a crotchety old man being like, oh, it'll never take off. We're not, like, I don't know, but it's like in my head, it's like, where is he? Why didn't he jump on this? But he didn't. He was a very slow adopter, even for the business. Here you see Jesse Hoyt's mill, and his estate has that number. So it's kind of fascinating, like looking through and seeing who you find and who you don't. Sometimes in history, like what you don't find triggers some interesting questions, right? Again, grainy because it's from the newspaper, but this is a photo of operators working at the exchanges, and this one's from 1906. So Saginaw directory shows us the immense variation in numbers as these things start up. It also shows us how standardization is going to matter in a while. Here's some more from just some ads. So you see here, this telephone number here is 82, but the druggist number is 854. So we've got all this variation, and eventually things are going to standardize. But these would be, so this is like the top of the directory page. They put these ads everywhere. This one was at the bottom, but I found Lou G. Moore liked to advertise in the directories. I found his down sides of pages across the top. He was all over this thing. So I guess that's the, I don't know, pharmacy that he was really, really going for there. So this one was then really interesting to me. So, I don't know, who speaks German? How do we say Getz, Gates, good? Getz? Wait, what did you say again? Getz. Thank you. I'm really bad with German, so I always appreciate when there's a German speaker around who can fix me up there. So one of the things I noticed, so oh wait, we got this one too. How do we say Frueh? Who said it? F-R-U-E-H. Frueh? Frueh? Frueh. Okay, we're all having German lesson today. I love it. Okay, so we've got Frueh and we've got Get, and they have very different looking phone numbers. So this is 827, and this one is 54-2 rings. And I gotta tell you, and this is the same page in the same directory. So I was like, I'm confused. And I said it to Catherine, I'm like, I don't know. And she's like, well, you gotta find out where the 2 rings is. And I'm like, I don't want to. And and we knew it had something to do with the party line, but how did and she was like, well, who was the other line? And I was like, but that means I have to read the whole directory. But thanks to technology, I actually found it relatively quick. Oh yeah, I blew that up there so you could see. So 54-2 rings. And then I was like, okay, so what are we doing here? So I start with Charles, and I find his page. And then, of course, it's see page 26. So he's like, look at my ad, which I love. Good for you. So then it took me a little searching, and I found that Charles Palmer, who was in lumber, had 54-3 rings. So what essentially that would be is that you would have to, the number of the rings is when you knew you were the one being called, which you can understand how that has some confusion. That's a good question, and I'm not sure. I mean, you can go through the operators, but then there's definitely an increase of direct dialing and cranking the right cranks, and there could be long and short as well, which I learned. So you could have your number could have been 3 long rings too short. So if these guys had 2 numbers following this dash, or sometimes there'd be a letter indicating that it was about the rings at that point, you could have If this said like 32, say, that would mean 3 long rings, 2 short rings. So imagine like thinking about that, but I guess you just get used to it. You don't really know anything else. So it's, I do want to play check my time. I want to play a short little video. It's from 1940. But they are dressed as if they're in what year? 1918, I think. He's going to explain how phones are working and why it's not great quality. We'll leave our friends there. But so you see, there's a lot that has to change with the technology of the lines themselves. And the Bell Company is owning and operating that part, in addition to the phones themselves, which we can see change over time as well. Ugh, these things are heavy. So, you know, you have your early crank phones, right? You can, again, those, and you might need to be connected, you're starting out needing to be connected with an operator, for sure. Now, operators are going to remain important for a very long part of our telephone history. As things change and there's a clear need for more standardization, that's also changing the phone technology as well. And you're going to see, let's slightly easier to show this one. You're seeing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar and have seen, a rotary dial phone. Now, a rotary dial phone, you can connect your call yourself because you have the number that you dial, and that sends the pulses which indicate where you're sending your call across the lines, okay? So all of that technology has to change to go with this growing need for phones. And in Saginaw, they make a switch. Oops. Oh, this was just interesting to me. It's in our collection. It's just a receipt. But you see here, this is early. This is 1890s something, because you could just fill in the year. And unfortunately, it wasn't filled in. So I don't know the exact year this receipt was filled out. But you see here, it just says telephone connection. So this would be a thing where you're going to pick up the phone and tell the operator you need P.L. Perkins. Okay, so this is sometimes you just get that. Sometimes you get the numbers like we looked at. So talking about moving forward into standardization, we're going to move Saginaw to a new dial system, and that will debut on July 12th, 1931. Now, this is a big news story. This is like lots and lots of news coverage. One of the things that goes along with this is the opening of the brand new bell tower down on Washington and James. Okay, so this all is coming together again with that technology changes, but how we disperse that technology, all of these things are having to grow and expand together. So that building that you now know as the AT&T building was the Bell building. The Saginaw News described it in this way: few buildings in Michigan are built with greater staunchness than the new edifice, which raises its tower 148 feet into the air. It had to be staunch, as they said, because of the weight and the amount of equipment that this building needed to hold and sustain. They also built it with an eye towards expansion. They actually didn't want to be stuck in the same position as they were on Genesee and Washington, where they couldn't really expand. They built this building with an eye towards the fact that at some point it would get bigger. And it did. In case you're curious, the base of the building, there we go, here's a postcard. The base of the building is made of granite, and the walls were made from Indiana limestone. So big coverage. It's the building, but it's also the biggest part of the news is the switch to the dial phone system. So here's our friend, Mayor George Phoenix. What a great name for this type of technology change. I mean, sometimes those moments just come together. So he makes the first call. They call it the cutover. So basically what happened is they had this system and they had the new dial system and they had it all done and they had to just basically do the last bits. And that's called the cutover, to move it from the old system to the new. And so basically everything's in place. Mayor Phoenix, he's going to make the first call on it. Michigan Bell president was here. His name was Birch Foraker. And he talked about the company's pride in their new Saginaw home. And he called it, quote, the largest, most beautiful telephone building in the state outside of Detroit. This was big news. This isn't just big Saginaw news. This is huge. They're expecting huge growth in this market for telephones. Mayor Phoenix used his speech to recount the time he met Alexander Graham Bell 60 years prior, and he got to witness the telephone work for the first time at that meeting. And then he presses a button on his desk to signal to the workers to cut from manual to automatic dialing. And it took less than 2 minutes, and he used his telephone and called his wife at home. Very nice. Then they held a dance on the still empty 5th floor, and then they served refreshments in the cafeteria. I mean, this is efficient. This is good party planning. And then the following weekend, they opened the building to the general public for tours. So, got a couple more. So here's another postcard. So again, this is a big deal. I mean, these are buildings that end up on postcards. So, I don't know if you all think of the building as beautiful or not, but at the time it was very much considered very beautiful and impressive. So here's an actual photograph of it shortly after it opened. This is the People's Bank, and it winds up in our collection tagged with telephone because it's sitting there, and I just thought it was a pretty picture with a nice telephone, so I included it. We'll go to that in a second. So, check my time. There are so many ways we can look at phones and think about phones. One of the things is that there are a lot of social changes that happen. It even includes etiquette changes that happen. So I told you many of the first phones were located in pharmacies, and that the Saginaw News, pharmacies were among the first to institute the new technology of a payphone because they thought it'd be great. People come make their call, they buy some stuff, they go on their way, but it turned out that they sometimes couldn't use their own phone because there was such a long line of people waiting to use their phone. And so they instituted pay phones where you had to pay a nickel to make your call. Now, the first phones, you actually paid after your call was completed, and then they had to reverse that. This was so it's interesting to think about payphones. They were really designed to actually cut back phone usage in particular places. And then, but by 1905, most upper and upper middle class families had phones. By 1920, most middle class families had phones at home. Very early, people who worked with phones, primarily women. Operators, their job requirements really took on gendered aspects very rapidly. They were to be genteel or respectable in deportment, accurate, have good attention to detail. They had to have good listening skills and speech. All of these things were considered to be characteristics of women rather than men. And then, so very quickly, I don't know where it was, too far back, there it is. So actually they developed the switchboards to fit women, so that women could sit and their reach, it matched women rather than men. If men were considered to have good phone manners, they were considered to be effeminate. But if you were calling a woman and you had poor manners and you spoke gruffly or slammed the phone down, you didn't have chivalry. So there's a balance. Don't be too good at the phone if you're a man, but also don't be too rude. So I thought that was really interesting that there were very quickly this etiquette around phones that really put things in gendered spaces. The first information technology illness comes with phones. So today you kind of hear people talk about stress and anxiety and different mental health related to too much phone or internet usage and things like that, right? Social media, whatever, we hear about that. But actually, in the early 1900s, they began to worry about what phones were going to do to women. And it was going to bring on stress and anxiety, and they thought it would lead to nervous breakdowns. They didn't want women who were single to be operators because they were worried that if you took on that job before you had children, you would give birth to nervous children. I was like, okay, all right. So some very interesting things. So lots of But the funny thing about that too, though, is, huzzah patriarchy. They were more concerned about the kids who were going to be born than they were about the stress on the women themselves. It's kind of like, okay, thanks for that. Actually, I don't know if I have a picture. Let me see. Okay, I do. So the other thing that happened that I found interesting, another thing you can look at, in addition to women being operators, in World War I, you have a new modern war. And they wanted to take advantage of new modern communications, right? So they needed to be able to make phone calls even from battlefields, but near the battlefields, back to bases, even all the way, back to central headquarters and things. So General Pershing first tried to enlist French women, but they didn't know how to operate phones. So then he recruited operators from the US, but you had to speak French. So this is a really small pool of people he's drawing from. You had to be really good in English as a phone operator, but also speak French well enough to translate messages. They would help with wartime communication that included troop movements, supplies, the supply lines, what was needed, things like that. They were dubbed the Hello Girls. And so this photo is from the Library of Congress. This isn't actually ours, but you see in papers here, women wanted. And they actually did start having to just teach women French because they had too small of a pool. These women were out in the fields, and they served one of the most vital functions in that war, and they were never acknowledged at that time for their efforts, and they were not considered part of the military. It wasn't until the 1970s that they were finally recognized and given veterans benefits, which you can imagine many weren't even alive. But, so kind of an interesting side story. So there's a lot of different ways that things are very connected to gender roles, but also kind of invisible, which we do know, women know that comes sometimes with changes in time. So AT&T, by 1930, 80% of all of the phones in the US were Bell phones. Those that were not, 98% of those that were not were connected through Bell lines, so they're still paying Bell service fees. The Great Depression hit the telephone companies really hard, and over 2 million subscribers canceled service between 1930 and 1933. Now, those pay phones that we talked about became important because do you want to pay that monthly subscription fee for your phone that you really can't afford right now? Or if you have a need to use a phone, you can go use a pay phone. And so a lot of people cancel. After 1833, subscriptions do again begin to climb, and then by the end of the decade, they reach their pre-depression levels. So we see then this is becoming a necessity. By this point, we're starting to really view this as a necessary utility, not a novelty or a convenience. Now, during World War II, the government instituted rate freezes. So AT&T is just kind of chilling out during that period. But as soon as the war ended, they began to snap up and consolidate companies again. So by 1970s, the monopoly was so thorough, there really wasn't any other phone company. And then they were slapped with an antitrust lawsuit. So 1974, the outcome of that suit was a forced divestiture, and they broke apart into 7 regional companies, and that became dubbed the Baby Bells. And then Michigan Bell was reorganized with other Midwest companies becoming Ameritech Corp. Later, Ameritech Corp merged with SBC Teleholdings and renamed it to Actually, well, yes, but then they actually circle themselves right back around to being AT&T. And I thought this was just kind of interesting to see. So, you can tell, like, you understand why they're really holding on to this Bell idea, right? Because it's harkening back to Alexander Graham Bell. Even up to 1969, you still see just a really simplified, this really matches the stylings of the era. This is just in color. Now, 1984 is when they decide to rebrand and go with something different, and they want to evoke like a global idea. And so they use this, and this is supposed to be like sound waves going through. A lot of people kind of laughed at the time and said it looked like the Death Star, because of course, Star Wars. They're not wrong. And then now this is the more current iteration, more rounded, globally looking, but still kind of holding on to that. So we talked about these. This reminds me, this is the first kind of phone. This was in my kitchen when I was a little girl. There were push button phones at that point, but we still had a rotary dial. Rotaries work with pulses that are sent, and so it takes time to move to a tonal system. So they work on it for a while. They actually created it in the 40s, but it's not until much later that they're able to successfully commercialize its use. So when you do a push button phone like this, it's based on tones that go out, not pulses. And you can see we can now have transfers and multiple extensions. So things change over time. And then in the 1970s, they develop mobile phones. This one in our collection is from Motorola. I'm just going to take my phone with me out down the town and, I need to make a call. Let me plug this into my car adapter and you can dial. Very convenient. This was like so cool if somebody had one of these. Do you remember? Yeah. By the 1990s, we start moving into 1G and 2G broadband cellular service. And so then our phones start getting smaller and smaller. And then, of course, as you know, our phones turn into mini computers that we carry in our pockets. So 2001 is when mobile broadband services become widely available to general consumers. So you kind of think about, I think about after college, I didn't even have, so I graduated in 2000, my undergrad, I didn't even have a cell phone. It really wasn't until I could, my husband never answered his work phone, and he was never near his work phone, and I'm like, okay, I can't. We're getting cell phones, so I can reach you. And at that point, it was like you made a phone call, and that was all you could do, right? So you think about that, and I don't know, it's still fast, right? We're still adjusting and adapting, and I don't think we always think about how much happens in our lifetimes, how quickly. So anyway, you all are actually welcome to come take a stroll down memory lane. You can come and you can crank my little crank phone. I'm not going to stand it. It's very heavy, so we'll just kind of leave it down so it's not quite the same as it being on the wall right now. Yeah, I want to invite you up to kind of take a stroll down memory lane with these phones. But I guess before we have people move around, does anybody have a question?
I had to go back to the picture with the ladies at the board, the last one.
The newspaper one or the
Yeah, I think it was
the Hello Girls? There we go.
There.
That one?
I have two siblings who were telephone operators, and I look at, that's called a cord board, and it just amazes me. Okay, I can see them plugging into get a call connected. Mm-hmm. But you look at all those cords, the call is done. Which one do they pull out?
No, it's amazing how skilled they were, and they had to keep track.
Yeah.
of all, like that whole attention to detail. They had to keep track of who was where and keep moving those cords. We do have a switchboard in our collection, but they wouldn't bring it over for me. They were like, no, it's too big and too heavy. We're not moving it right now. And so I get it. Maybe I'll convince them to do an exhibit where we can pull it out. But because it's fascinating to think about what it takes to keep track of those calls to move those cords. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
What are they doing those telephone buildings now?
The AT&T building is still a telephone company building.
I know, but what do they do?
It's a business office for the phone company, so I don't know exactly what they do. They don't have staffing that truly needs that whole building now. I think their staff is down to something like 80 people for Saginaw in there, but it is still just a central business office for the phone company.
Part of that building is all equipment.
Is it? Okay. Okay.
That's why it was built, was for the equipment.
Who's, I'm seeing pointing. Who's going to ask the question?
I worked at the cord board.
Oh, you did?
And the cords were together. There were two cords for every call. So if you picked up the call with one cord, you lifted it up to connect it to another cord.
Oh.
So it was easy to pull the cords out because they were together.
So when they were done, you just kind of pull them both?
The lights would go out, and then when you were done, you pull them out.
That's so cool.
Well, so you knew which ones to pull. Okay. Together, there was the one that was plugged in with an operator, and the other one you plugged in and dialed the number one.
That's cool. Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating. There's so many things to learn about, right? Like the work and...
Like on the coin phones, the operators had to know the tone of all the coins. And then the charge meter, and then they would drop it, and then you had to keep track of the time. When the time was up for what they paid for, you had to go back in and say, you have this much money, and you start dropping the coins down. And every coin has different tones.
Yeah.
So that was a 55.
Yeah.
She was accurate.
With respectable deportment.
With respectable support.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. That is very interesting.
And then soon after that, they went to where you could dial your number direct. You had operators sitting like in a row just so keypad, and the operator communicated your number, please, and then they would key in the number that you were calling, and that's how they go.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
When I started, I sorted long distance calls on pieces of paper with things. And imagine them writing on that piece of paper while I was doing a chord and all that other stuff. It's just, yeah.
Cool. Yes. All right. I didn't mention cord. I was just looking at the change in technology. I forgot to mention cordless phones were introduced in 1970s. In 1986, the FCC granted a frequency range of 47 to 49 megahertz, which would allow for less interference. And then in 1990, they granted the frequency range of 900 megahertz. And this all like advanced the ability for those cordless phones to have less interference, because if you remember early ones, you could sometimes just pick up somebody else's phone call, like you were kind of like here, like there was like cross chatter. So those improvements, were especially important for like removing that interference. So you had like a private call that you were kind of expecting to be private. So that's in there too, and they didn't give me a cordless phone to show you. So yeah.
When I was young, we had a party line.
Yeah.
And getting people off the party line had an emergency.
Oh. Yeah. Sylvia was talking about party lines before we started. Yeah. That.
F1, 5 4, yeah.
And there were changes and there were actually changes in the phone numbers and the way I mentioned that they became more standardized, and I didn't really talk a lot about that. But so you did have, the party line was a specific thing, and then the direct phone numbers were a very specific thing. But for a time, you actually had letters and numbers because city regions, like if you were going to make a call to Los Angeles, the phone number would have started LA and then a number. If you were calling New York City, it would have started with NY something. There were a lot of, and not just the big cities, but a lot of places had those. And I know then, the idea was like it would be easier to like remember and identify where something was, but of course that has a certain limitation as well. And so numbers became more standardized, and now we know that we not just have the 7-digit number, which always had like an area code, but now we're moving into spaces where you have to have that because of, again, growing need for more. So all of these advances, it kind of like need plus technology kind of keeps, moving us along. Yes?
When I was a kid, I remember we only had dial the button.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Right, because...
First time I went out of town, I didn't realize that other places dial the whole thing.
Right. Yeah. Cool. I do remember my first phone number. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because here it was Swift or Pleasant, right? Is that what I learned?
It was Pleasant, what side?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I don't know why they chose Swift and Pleasant. I didn't see anything that said how that got picked, but I've heard lots of people, as I've said, I was prepping this, were like, oh, I remember I was Swift or I was Pleasant, and they're, so
Well, then they
it's,
changed from TL
it's,
to 7-9 or
right.
7-5, yeah.
But it is rooted in our community memory. So, all right, well, there are so many fascinating paths you can go down with telecommunication history. It's really fascinating. So I guess I just hope that was like a little taste, and that you'll feel free to come up and actually look at these things, because that's part of what I wanted. You can, yeah.